चलिए इस बीच मिड कैप में एक्शन कहां पर ये देख लेते हैं। कुछ एक स्टॉक जहां पर काफी अच्छा रुझान देखने को मिल रहा है। इसमें डीएचएफएल है जो कि 6% ऊपर है, साथ ही डीएलएफ, आईजीएल, एचडीआईएल, सन फार्मा एडवांस, जस्ट डायल, आईआरबी इंफ्रा, डीसीबी बैंक, अदानी पावर, ये सारे मिड कैप के जो हैवी गेनर्स हैं उसकी लिस्ट है। हमारे साथ अब अजय बग्गा भी जुड़े हैं। अजय, आज ये जो तेजी बाजार में देखने को मिल रही है सर्वे पेश होने के बाद, इसमें आपकी स्ट्रैटेजी क्या होगी? आप और खरीदारी की सलाह देंगे या रुकेंगे?
बिल्कुल रुकना चाहिए। मंडे को इतना बड़ा इवेंट आ रहा है, ये मार्केट बहुत ओवरसोल्ड था। थोड़ा सा हम देख रहे हैं कि एक टेक्निकल बाउंस है, इसमें आप ज़्यादा कन्विक्शन नहीं है इस बाउंस में, तो अभी भी बहुत कन्विक्शन नहीं है मार्केट में। और मैं यही कहूँगा कि आप पोजीशंस हल्की रखिए और बजट हो जाने दीजिए, फिर तय करते हैं क्या करना है। अभी टाइम नहीं है इन्वेस्ट करने का।
बिल्कुल। चलिए इस बीच मूडीज से हमारे साथ खास मेहमान मौजूद हैं। आज इकोनॉमिक सर्वे जो पेश हुआ उस पर बात करने के लिए हमारे साथ अच्छी शेठ इस समय सीधे सिंगापुर से मौजूद हैं। अच्छी, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग अस, प्लेजर हैविंग यू ऑन द शो। फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, ये जो सर्वे पेश हुआ है उसमें कॉशियस लाइन ली गई है, लेकिन बैंक्स में रिकैपिटलाइजेशन पर काफी फोकस किया गया है, बोल्ड स्टेटमेंट दिया गया है। व्हाट इज योर फर्स्ट रिएक्शन? आप क्या क्यूज ले रही हैं मार्केट के लिए फ्रॉम द इकोनॉमिक सर्वे?
Sure. I'll address the question here on banks first, because from our perspective, that has been a constraint on India's growth outlook. As you know, the balance sheets of banks are weighed down by weak asset quality, and that is being addressed. I mean, we saw that in some of the profit statements that came out in recent weeks, that banks are addressing them, and that has obviously impacted their profits negatively. But going forward, recapitalization is the way that these bank balance sheets will be strengthened again, so that credit growth can proceed, and then you can have the economic growth that India is capable of. But until bank balance sheets are cleaned up, first on the asset side where their weak assets are addressed, and then on the capitalization side where they do have the capital to sustain higher credit growth, until that happens, I think they will not be able to support growth. And frankly, in India, without banks supporting growth, that growth will also remain quite subdued.
Okay, exactly जैसे कि आपने कहा, विदाउट बैंकिंग कुछ नहीं होने वाला। असली जी, दो तीन फैक्टर से बात करना चाहता हूँ मैं। इकोनॉमिक सर्वे में जो बात कही गई सीपीआई को लेकर FY17 के जो टारगेट्स, जो रेंज दी गई है, दैट इज 4.5 to 5%। एग्जैक्टली इससे आपको कितना कंफर्ट मिल रहा है? और दूसरी बात एग्जैक्टली मैम, कि आप इस बजट स्पीच में फॉर बैंक्स एग्जैक्टली क्या क्या सुनना चाहती हैं, चाहे वो कैपिटलाइजेशन हो, क्वांटम ऑफ मनी डिप्लॉयड फॉर कैपिटलाइजेशन, और दूसरी चीज बैंक के मर्जर्स के लिए अगर कोई रोड मैप दिया जाता है तो वो कितना सही होगा?
On the question on consumer price inflation, look, since the central bank, the RBI, instituted its inflation targeting framework, what we've seen is that it's met its target, that it aimed for early this year in January. And so one thing that we, looking ahead, we think about is, look, if there are pressures on India's inflation, and India has a long history of inflation volatility, and undoubtedly there would be some volatility this year as well. If there are pressures, we expect the central bank to act to assuage them. So keeping this, 4.5% target in mind, you should make sure, sort of also keep in mind that may require central bank tightening at some point if inflation goes up. Now, what would take inflation up? At this point, growth is not strong enough, and sort of non-food prices are not strong enough to drive that inflation. So the real risk to inflation largely comes from food prices. And that, of course, is the great thing that nobody can predict, whether there's a drought this year or not. So the risks I see to that target are not from central bank inaction, but from food price volatility. Okay. I would say that on inflation. Then the second point you raised was on bank recapitalization, right, and how we would look at bank recapitalization in terms of fiscal deficit. We already know that this is something that the government is going to do. So in a sense, the cost is already priced in our minds. Now the question is that will you have this cost leading to concurrent benefits? So if you have recapitalization, but you don't change the way in which banks do business, in the way banks assess risk, in the way that banks handle their non-performing assets, then you'll come, this problem will recur 4 to 5 years down the line. So really, from our perspective, yes, the expenditure is there. That's that is occurring because of what happened in the past. That can't change. What can change is preventing this expenditure from recurring. And that isn't really fiscal policy, but that is bank supervision by the RBI. So that's where we would look at for the banks. Now, I think that answers your two major questions. And in terms of what we're looking for from this budget, we think, look, the budget is really a statement of the government's finances.
Right.
Now, in the past, in 1991, the budget made many statements about regulations and this and that and the other. Over the last few years, regulatory policies, structural reform policies, all those are not announced necessarily in the budget. They're announced throughout the year.
Right.
So from the budget, what we're expecting is a statement on whether this past fiscal consolidation, the budget deficit has come down from 6.5% of GDP to 4.1% of GDP last year. Over 5 years, this is what happened from 2010 to 2015.
Right.
Now we want to see whether it's going to go down further or not. So that, I guess, is what the budget will reveal.
Right. Last question to you, Atsi. So, keeping this in mind, Indian markets पर आपका view क्या है? Is the worst behind for Indian markets?
Well, Indian markets are really, whereas the Indian economy is relatively insulated from what goes on in the rest of the world because it has its own domestic market, the Indian financial sector is not insulated. So I do believe that India will be vulnerable to any shift in global sentiment with regard to emerging markets. That is a vulnerability.
Right.
How it stands out amidst emerging markets will depend on whether its growth path looks sustainable, whether this high growth of 7.5% is actually sustained without inflation and current account deficit cutting the growth cycle short.
Right. All right, Atsi, thanks for joining us. बहुत-बहुत शुक्रिया हमारे साथ इस बातचीत में शामिल होने के लिए.